All right. Good evening, everybody. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Yep. All right. So the plan for today, we're going to kind of continue the conversation from where we left off. In a way, I think we may be kind of answering a similar type of a question we answered last study. I think if I may kind of quickly give a overview of that question, here it is. If covenants and dispensations are cause and effect of sovereignty, why not study scripture using the sovereign blueprint of God as a framework, or lack of a better term, the so-called integrated sovereignism? So the idea here is, I think last study, we kind of answered the question if covenants and dispensations are alpha and omega of humanity, why not study with that lens, right? So we are kind of enhancing the same question. We are kind of framing it in a way, if covenants and dispensations respectively are the cause and effects of sovereignty of God. So that is the way I'm kind of framing this question. So let's see how the conversation goes. And again, as always, we do a little bit of a recap. So as you might recall, if everybody can see the slide, on study one, I think we kind of took a survey approach by answering the question why we need a dynamic framework like integrated sovereignism that models scriptural sovereign reality as accurately as possible, right? So we kind of took a kind of the lay of the land, or surveying all the worldviews, and then kind of framed why we need a dynamic framework, because all the other frameworks are more static in nature, right? That's kind of the way we framed it. And if you might recall, we kind of plotted all the worldviews using two levers, the degree of discontinuity and degree of progressivity. And then we plotted all the major worldviews, like in Judaism, Judeo-Christian worldview, Islam, and Hinduism. And then we kind of put a point, like our approach is still a superset of all the worldviews. And then we took the same kind of a quadrant and then plotted all the four popular frameworks within the Judeo-Christian worldview, like the classic covenantalism, classic dispensationalism, and then progressive covenantalism and progressive dispensationalism. And then we kind of framed it in a way, this integrated sovereignism is a kind of an amalgamation or superset, because we are shifting from the discontinuity and progressivity into sovereignty, right? That's kind of the way we framed it. And then in study two, we kind of answered the question, if covenantalism and dispensationalism are two sides of the same coin called sovereignty, why not study scripture using that lens, right? So that we can strike two birds with one stone, so to speak, right? That's the kind of the question we answered in study number two. And then we kind of used that Isaiah 44:7 as an anchoring verse. And then we kind of went through a structured way of defining the terminologies. And then we kind of used our master sovereignty equation as a frame of reference to kind of prove covenantalism conditions levers 1, 2, 3. As you can see the equation in the bottom portion of the screen, whereas dispensationalism conditions are strengthens lever 4 and 5. That's the way we kind of framed it in a very high level. So with that, which kind of bringing our discussion back to today, the study number 3, again, if I may kind of restate the kind of the question, if covenants and dispensations are the cause and effects of sovereignty, why not study scripture using the sovereignty lens, so that we can strike the two birds with the same stone, so to speak? So the idea here, again, it is, as you might look, the kind of the question is very similar to the question we answered in the last study, but although in a slightly different context. The reason I'm doing this is we are trying to look at this topic from different vantage points so that, you get a much bigger overview, and not only just that overview, but also it kind of helps you to think before we dive deeper and answer those three questions. I think, as you might recall, we had laid out the three questions in study number 1, which we are going to get to it in the next, say, depending upon how this study goes, we'll get to it. But yes, the idea here is, before we answer those three questions, like the three questions answered by most of the popular theology books, I thought, since we are kind of framing a new approach, it makes sense to give a lot more introduction to make you think, so that when we answer those questions, we can come back and relate to it. So that's the reason I'm kind of trying to ask these questions from multiple vantage points, just so that you can all think and then fully convinced before we start answering those questions. I think that's the kind of the context here. So that said, again, like we did last study, I'm going to kind of use the same Isaiah 44:7 as a reference verse, because this is one of the beautiful verses which gives us a compelling case why we need to study scripture using a structured approach. Again, this verse applies to all the frameworks. So the idea here is, we are in the step number 2 and 3 out of the 5 steps. I think we are trying to lay the foundation for step number 2, declare, and then step number 3, lay out. So that's kind of the idea here. So I just thought I'll just state it one more time so that we all can be aligned on this verse. That said, to answer these questions, again, like we did last time, some terminologies and basic definitions. And this time, again, like we defined last time, the definitions here are a little more causality focused definitions. So I just want you to really pay attention to the kind of the things in the red, right? So if you look at both the definitions here, one thing, I'm not defining covenantalism per se, but I am defining covenants and dispensations. So that's the kind of the difference between this definition versus the definition we did last time. And similarly, if you look at the red portion of the definition, the way I have framed the terminologies will look very similar between both. So I just want you to remember that. That said, if you look at the covenants, I'm starting from this is a kind of the same definition you might have heard in different framing, different languages. So this is 100% scriptural. And, this is covenants are contractual or conditional clausal causes, okay? And then it also includes, if you kind of fulfill that conditional causes, what is the promissory effects, okay? And in the form of laws or principles, although the focus is on the causal clauses, which is kind of very important when you define covenants. On the flip side, if you look at the same thing, dispensations, it starts from the promissory effects of those contractual conditional clauses. I think that's something, it's the same thing, I'm flipping it. But then again, how does that manifest? It manifests in the form of laws or principles. The focus here is the promissory effects. Hope you can see the difference. Again, I think if you can grasp that point when you go into the subsequent slides, hopefully it'll make a lot more sense. But the point here is, I think the covenants, they focus on the clauses, the causes, whereas dispensations focus on the promissory effects. I think once you understand that, both of them, by and large, they manifest in the form of laws or principles. So that point also is critical. I think when you go into the subsequent slides, you'll understand what I mean by that. As long as you understand the kind of the definitions at this point in time, I will kind of come back to and point out this definition when you go through some of the detailed slides. Hopefully you can connect back the point. The reason I'm saying is because we are going to use this definitions as a frame of reference to build our cause and effect relationship. Hopefully that's the kind of the reason I'm saying this is very important to kind of grasp this point. That said, I think if you can go into the next slide, like last time. So if you say covenants and dispensations are cause and effect, so the point is, how do you prove it? I know this is a little bit of the crowded slide, So this is kind of, in a way, is going to be our anchor slide. So what I'm going to do is, I want you to request you to focus on the first part, the God's master covenant to himself part. I'll explain the top portion first, and then from there we will pivot into a couple of other slides, and then we'll come back to the kind of the God's covenant to humanity. Okay, so that we can kind of understand the point I am trying to frame. Okay, so here is the kind of my point of view at this point in time. The point of view here is, I think we all know God's covenant to humanity, right? We all know all the kind of the way people, some will say 7, 8, 10, depending upon how you classify. But what I'm kind of suggesting is, if you step back to the node 0 of the universe, okay, as we kind of look at that from that standpoint, especially when you start from Psalms 89:34, there is an immutable covenant. I think I put a verse there. I think the verse says, I will not violate my covenant or alter the words. The Hebrew roots here is uppercase words, what my lips have uttered. So this is what theologians say, it's an immutable covenant. And by and large, all of them referred back to the Genesis 1:2, when God said, let there be light. So my kind of point of view here is, when God said, let there be light, that was the first covenant cause, or his master covenant, which happened there in Genesis 1:2. So that was the kind of the first cause for the whole universe came into existence as we know today. And similarly, on the flip side, the whole first principles came into existence as an effect. So remember, this covenant, most of the theologians say God made this to himself, means to Trinity. So the kind of the action, God, the universe came into existence, and also the first principles came into existence. Together, they manifested as a sovereignty covenant. Isaiah 49:6, that's the reason God says, I've kind of inscribed everything on the palm of my hand. So when we put these verses together, Psalm 89:34, Genesis 1:2, and then Isaiah 49:6, I'm almost convinced this is the master covenant which was set in motion, okay, when God said, let there be light. I kind of, for lack of a better term, I kind of call that as a lightning cause, or similarly, I'll come back and talk about what I mean by the rhythmic cause when we go into Genesis 2:7. Okay, once that master covenant and master dispensation called sovereignty of God was set in motion. In other words, what I'm saying is the cause, I'm calling it as the sovereignty of God, and the effect is first principles, which is I call the sovereignty of dispensation of sovereignty. So when they were set in motion, and then fast forward on the 6th day, God comes and breathes his spirit into Adam, and humanity gets formed, spirit, soul, and body dimensions. That is the starting point. So I kind of call that as a breathmic cause and breathmic effect. And that is the point in time the whole sovereignty of God got inscribed into Adam's spirit. Jeremiah 33:34. Based on that, humanity was formed. Adam got created in God's image in spirit, soul, and body. So that is the kind of the starting point of the master covenant of Genesis 1:2 and 2:7. The master covenant cause was set in motion. First principles of the effect was set in motion. And that is the covenant and dispensation we are living. I kind of call that as a master covenant or master dispensation, which is the covenant we are living in today as we speak. And the kind of the implication of that statement is God's master covenant to humanity are all sub-covenants within the master covenant and the master dispensation. That's the kind of the point. So hopefully, if you can kind of understand that cause and effect sequence, then it will be kind of easy for us to understand the cause and effect sequence, which we'll be seeing in the second part of the slide. So before we get into the second part of the slides, I kind of, now that we have laid out the first part of the master covenant and the dispensation, I kind of want us to go to some guiding principles to kind of understand what exactly that means. What are the guiding principles which were set in motion by when God said, let there be light, and then when God breathed his spirit into Adam's nostrils. So these are the kind of, again, there are a lot more. I've tried my best to capture and synthesize it within one slide. But I just want you to kind of understand, read, and grasp this point, because this will be very important when we go through all this. Kind of, I have classified the covenant to humanity as 7 covenants, which is by and large most theologians do. So I just want you to understand this guiding principles, because they apply across all of those 7 covenants. Okay, that said, let me quickly kind of read it. The sovereignty of God in the first master covenant, which is in the cause form, and the first master dispensation, which is an effect form, which is first principles, govern all the sub-covenants within it. So this is an important point. In the first principles, they govern all the sub-covenants, including grace, what we are living in today. So that's something, point number 1. And point number 2, every ST-bound realm within those 7 covenants and 7 dispensations are 100% governed by the first principle, okay? And then when we come into the every part of it, okay, there are some sub-covenant principles and sub-covenant laws, which is very specific to those covenants. So just want to make sure, regardless of which covenant we are in, okay, everything is governed by the master principles, and then every one of those covenants have their specific covenant specific principles. Hope that points make it clear. That said, now when it comes to the first part of the covenant, okay, for example, when we are, I'm going to just pick to kind of explain the third guiding principle. Let's pick covenant of law, like a Mosaic covenant, and then covenant of grace. So all the laws within the Mosaic covenant or that dispensation period are 100% valid in that ST-bound period. However, when it comes to the subsequent covenant, they become nice to have principles, not rules. This is an important point. So like as we said, the first principle also are overarching. They go across all the 7 covenants. Similarly, every other laws or principles within the first covenant, they apply to all the other subsequent covenants below it in the form of principles are nice to have. In other words, the subsequent covenants overrides the laws within the previous covenants. Yes, it overrides, but at the same time, it doesn't negate it. That means, say, for example, let's take an example what Jesus does in Matthew 12, right? When he heals a person on a Sabbath day. Similarly, and you'll start eating the grains during a Sabbath day, and then people will be complaining. So the point again is that is a classic example. When what Jesus says is, okay, when there is a need, that part, when Jesus was institutionalizing a grace covenant, okay, the Mosaic laws are not, they are not executed as a rule, rather as a principles. It is, if you want to honor, it is good, but then there is not a strict law that you cannot do something on a Sabbath period. So hopefully you can get the point. Similarly, all the food laws, say for example, even today, Old Testament Leviticus talks about so many laws within the kind of the Mosaic covenant. When we are living in this grace covenant, Yes, if you are willing to honor it, it is good. Because for some health reasons, there are some good reasons. If you follow all the laws, it is good for you. But there is just not a rule you got to follow. Hope you understand the point. That is the kind of the difference between when I say subsequent covenants override the previous covenant laws, but it doesn't negate it. So hopefully that point is clear. Now, when you come back to number 4, okay, the covenantal causes and dispensation effects are revealed in a step-by-step manner to help us to balance our sovereignty equation. Okay, this whole idea, okay, when God said, let there be light, when the master covenant was set in motion, when humanity was created, all along, okay, when we look at it from our vantage point, the reason God was establishing covenant after covenant was to help humanity to balance this equation. I'm sure this point we've already talked about it when we come into the details, plus I'll make a point. I just wanted to make sure you're aware of that, the kind of the statement. Similarly, on the flip side, every one of the 5th point here is the covenantal causes and dispensation effects are revealed in a step-by-step manner in direct proportion to how much consciousness state within each specific covenant dispensation could handle it. In other words, every step of the way, our consciousness was evolving or improving or enlightening. So in direct proportion to that enlightenment, God was revealing things in a step-by-step manner. So again, we kind of talked about this point in an earlier study also, but I just want you to be aware of that point. So hopefully, again, I just want you to be aware of this guiding principles when we go into some of this, back to our master slide. So hopefully this point will kind of help you to grasp some of the points I'm going to kind of highlight in the next slide. So now if you come back to our kind of anchor slide. So if you go back to kind of the master covenant to humanity, again, I took the 7 covenants, which is kind of the most popular, most theologians kind of slice it in as a 7 covenant model. So if you look at that, the column in the spirit side, if you say it is more of a covenant, I kind of framed it as a cause, and in the soul is a effect. And then finally, when it comes to action, they combine together, they get a conditional clause, gets evaluated, and depending upon whether it's a success or failure, and then it loops back into the 2nd covenant. That's that's where I kind of put the circular kind of cyclical arrow there. So that's kind of the way I want you to look at it. Again, remember, we are going to use this slide to prove a point. Why covenant is a cause, dispensation is an effect, and together they combine together. The clause gets evaluated depending upon success or failure. Then God intervenes in the predestined appointed time, and then he institutes a next covenant. That's the kind of the sequence. I think if you can kind of understand, grasp this point, which is again governed by the same model, M plus B greater than actual. So it's the same consciousness equation or salvation equation model, because which is governed by our sovereignty equation, and first principles are set in motion here. So now, that said, if you look at that, see, again, I don't want to go into details about every one of the classes. Let's say in the Edenic covenant, how the dispensation, the way theologians have named the dispensation itself gives us a clue. See, if you look at the thing, they are all very effect focused. What it is doing to our soul. That's how they've named it. So see, that's the reason I'm saying when the Edenic covenant is more about the law focused, or the person who signed the contract with God, whereas the dispensations are focused on the effect it has left within our consciousness, more specifically within the soul part of the consciousness. So in other words, every one of those covenants, when they were in operation, it was strengthening or conditioning our consciousness, and more specifically, it was conditioning or strengthening our soul part as a layer after layer. So every step of the way, if you can imagine, every one of those covenants, we're strengthening or conditioning or enlightening our soul step by step. In fact, I got another slide to kind of explain that point. I'll get to it in a moment, but I think I wanted to grasp this point. Again, without going to every one of those covenant by covenant, the way the covenants are named and the way the dispensations are named clearly tell a story. The covenants are the cause because the person who signed it, the clauses, conditions which were in governance during that period, and the dispensations were how they were shaping the soul. For example, innocence, which talks about the innocence part of the soul. Conscience, the basically the whole good and evil kind of the conscience gets enlightened a little bit more. And then the government part, it is politics and economics discipline gets formed. Promise, again, law. I'll come back and explain. Maybe we can go line by line in a minute, but I just want you to understand the kind of the cause and effect in a macro level across all the different dispensations and covenants. And then the point again, I'm kind of saying here is before I'll go back to the condition, the failure part, and how it trickles back to the next covenant. Again, this is something I want you to imagine now when you're looking at every one of the cause and effect, just in your back of your mind, imagine this sovereignty equation, okay, strengthening the soul part of it during every iteration. Remember in the picture there, I kind of want you to imagine in the soul, how it is getting strengthened here is, go to this slide. So this is the every step of the way in individual and cumulative level. Remember, every one of us, when God breathed Adam into the world, we got instantiated similar to the first principles model. And every step of the way, individual cumulative means every covenant is strengthening our consciousness in this format, okay? This is purely as one person, says Charles Prabhakar, this is one cycle, one instance just for me. Okay, that's what I said, individual and cumulative for the last, right from the moment I was born into this world. Similarly, it kind of applies to every one of us. Similarly, if I have to kind of talk about the collective and cumulative for all the covenants and dispensations so far, and how they kind of gets aggregated, I want you to look at this slide very carefully. I know this is a little bit of like a chart, but if you look at that, I took the slide from the individual consciousness, and then I kind of put that in, say, let's start from kind of the Edenic, like sovereignty is the zero, and then the Edenic Adam and Eve, just put two things, that consciousness, okay, the consciousness cycle from the earlier view got aggregated as a kind of the cylinder, okay? And then if you look at the covenant by covenant, every step of the way, that cylinder is going from one state of the consciousness to the next state. Remember the arrow here, CS1 conscious, CS1, CS2, CS3, CS4, CS5, CS6, CS7, CS8, 9, 10, okay? So the point here is, as we go from Edenic to Adamic covenant, and then Noahic and Abrahamic, the consciousness state was shifting from a notch up, going from level up. Okay, and then when you go into the thing, then when you look at that three-dimensional thing, there are multiple people. I just put that two people in Edenic, Adam and Eve. As the time progresses, by the time now it could be 8 billions, or even by the time 2050, 10 billions of people. Hope you can imagine this. So that's what I kind of call that as a collective and cumulative consciousness. So the idea here is every step of the way, God was revealing the instructions, laws needed to balance that specific consciousness state. So state appropriate revelation. So that was from a sovereignty equation standpoint, this is what God is doing. Okay. As your consciousness gets enlightened, depending upon how much you can grasp, he was revealing instruction for you to help you to balance this equation. That's the kind of the point. Hope if you can see this kind of the slide, this is more of a collective and cumulative, and this is from individual cumulative. And then now when you go back to this slide, so the sovereignty equation, every step of the way, God was strengthening them both from an individual and collective consciousness standpoint. And obviously, when you come back to grace, covenant and dispensation, we'll talk about the grace part a little later. So now with that prelude, what I wanted to talk about is, again, now that we have talked about the cause and effect, the action part, see the condition, how God was evaluating. Again, if you look at the right-hand side of the action part, it just goes so dawn on me. God is running this universe or planet, how you want to call it, like a kind of a company. A CEO would be running a company. So first covenant, as soon as he comes in, okay, obviously the Edenic covenant is a direct worship. That didn't work out. You know the story. Let's start from the Adamic covenant. So what was the kind of the main condition? God institutionalized a mission statement for Adam and Eve. Worship is work and work is worship. We already talked about it in Genesis 2:15. Obviously, when that mission was institutionalized, these things did not go as expected by God. But at the same time, I want you to, when I say failure, it is not just failure, quite failure yet. It didn't work out the way God had expected. But at the same time, on the flip side, it worked out in a way to give enough enlightenment for humanity so that they were ready for the next covenant. That's the point. I want you to grasp it. Let me say it again. Yes, from God's expectation standpoint, that mission statement got failed. However, on the flip side, from man's standpoint, humanity's consciousness was enough enlightened to receive the next covenant. That's the point. Hopefully you can see that when I say failure of the mission statement. Okay, once the mission statement got didn't go out the way God expected, now God comes back and establishes the second covenant with Noah. He chooses his family. Okay, and then you know the story. I don't want to go into all the story. Now he takes the family and then he says, okay, I'm going to do a reset. And that condition for that reset is, okay, he's giving a sustainability strategy. You got to go across the earth. The problem with the Adamic covenant was they were concentrated in one place, okay? So that's the reason the mission statement didn't work very well. So now he chooses Noah family, and then he gives the new strategy called sustainability strategy. Go and consume and spread across the earth and consume the resources sustainably. We have already talked about that point in an earlier study. So now, because of that, the government got established. Everything is good, it's going fine. But then by the time towards the end of that covenant or the dispensation, even at this point in time, Noah's family didn't spread across the whole earth as God had intended. So the sustainability strategy didn't quite work as per the expectation of God. So what does God do? He now had to institute a second covenant. Before that, what he does is, remember the Tower of Babel. So what he did was, the intervention here is God purposefully forces the people to spread across by confusing the language. So remember, this is a point we talked about our vernacular virtualization strategy. So now, again, yes, that was the strategy God uses to disperse the people to go across the world. But at the same time, using the vernacular virtualization process of inventing languages, that is simultaneously on the flip side is enlightening the consciousness. Remember the point. So now the point is, since Noah's family didn't do it and God does that, then when that is dispersed, finally he comes back and now chooses Abraham. So this is the point in time the Abrahamic covenant gets instituted, you know, the promise and everything. Okay, so now at that point in time, okay, well, what is happening is now, yes, people went all over. The promise was happening. Plus now what happens was still the whole governance, okay, like a company. Now the failure was the governance was not working correctly, or you can call it like a lawlessness, or the board was not working properly per se. So what has God, yes, it has accomplished what he has accomplished, what God wanted humanity to accomplish, but for God's expectation, okay, God had to intervene again. Now he had to pick Moses, and then he has to institute the next covenant. Again, in the middle, I'm going in a very high level. In the middle, you know all the stories behind it. So the point again here is every step of the way, there was a covenant, there was a period of kind of the covenant strengthening or enlightening the consciousness, the soul part of the consciousness, and the condition gets evaluated, and then God institutes this next covenant. So hopefully you can look at the whole causal chain, how it is working. So the cause, effect, condition evaluated, and then it triggers the next covenant. That's the point I want you to see it. Now, when it comes to, again, the Mosaic covenant, again, law gets instituted. Again, kind of the point, yes, law is good. People are able to honor the law, but still, again, the reason, in a way, God is probably playing a chess game. God knew. So this is maybe as much as God is trying to institute the covenant after covenant, God is also teaching humanity. For example, the law covenant himself, God knows human depravity because of the fall of mankind. On our own, you can never balance this equation, okay? So, but then God had to go through this period of the dispensation and this covenant to prove that point to humanity. No matter how much you try, you can never 100% honor all the laws. That means the implication is you can never balance this equation on your own. So that is to prove a point then which triggers the grace covenant. So hopefully you can see the causal relationship. So now once the point is humanity has understood, okay, I can do anything on my own, now we need a pull. So that is where the new covenant comes in the form of Jesus, the grace gets instituted. Now, okay, now we are in the grace, the pull comes in, again goes back to the sovereignty. Everything is election. So here again, God ties the whole thing back to sovereign blueprint. So all along, the whole sovereignty thread goes across all the covenants one by one, especially when you come to the new covenant. It's all about starts in alpha and omega. It starts with sovereignty and ends with sovereignty. So that's like another point, beautiful. So God had to go through the step-by-step way to reveal this point back to humanity. So now, again, we are in the grace covenant and the grace dispensation. Again, this is, I kind of call that as a rescue mission. We've been rescued, but then we are supposed to scale. The test is Great Commission. So that is again a test which is as we speak gets evaluated. Okay, so the point here is till that clause is completely evaluated, the next covenant or next dispensation is not going to come. Obviously, we talked about it. God is an interesting God. He has got a kind of a plan A, plan B. The plan B is he can bring heaven on earth so that he can go. So the Great Commission is the kind of the thing we talked about, the kingdom of heaven and kingdom of God. So it is a kind of the multi-dimensional covenant dispensation period. We can bring heaven on earth, get yourself prepared, but then it's kind of the kingdom of God, kingdom of heaven is here, but not yet. So the kind of thing that this rescue mission scaling is still in process as we speak. So depending upon kind of when it gets triggered, when the next kind of the dispensation, next covenant gets triggered, only God knows, which again goes back to sovereignty of God. So the point again here is, again, if you have to you're kind of almost close to the top of the hour, just to kind of summarize the point, the idea here is when we go back and look at it from the master covenant and master dispensation effect standpoint, everything fits in perfectly because all the sub-covenants, they are all kind of if I have to say in an object-oriented language, they're all kind of the subclasses. It gets instantiated from this master class called sovereignty of God. That's how it looks like. So that's how the whole blueprint was kind of unfolding as per the sovereignty equation. So hopefully, I know it's a lot to grasp, a lot to digest. So hopefully, again, in a very high level, having gone through this blueprint in multiple studies before, my hope is you would have grasped this point, kind of understood how I have framed it. So if you can understand that point, I think everything else will fall in place. I know I want to kind of make sure we have some 5 or 10 minutes for us to kind of open up the floor to discuss. So let me kind of quickly summarize and kind of wrap up this session. If needed, maybe we can have another follow-up session even next week. So just to kind of highlight again, this slide, I know this is itself is worth kind of diving deeper, but I just want you to make sure if you can understand the individual cumulative part and collective cumulative part, this slide. Hopefully, if you can grasp that point. So, hopefully if you have some questions, we can answer it in a kind of Q&A. And that said, kind of quickly, if I have to summarize, again, like you said last time, the point again here is the covenant and dispensations are cause and effect relationship with sovereignty. When you look at that standpoint, all the covenants and dispensations, they are all sub-covenants, sub-dispensation within the master covenant called sovereignty of God and master dispensation called sovereignty of God, because they are also established in a cause and effect form as we saw before. So the idea here is the sovereignty is the master covenant that was caused by the God's lightning rhythmic cause, Psalms 89:34. Similarly, on the flip side, it's a master dispensation that was affected or sustained by God's lightning rhythmic effect. I think once you understand, both are kind of the supporting points with each other. And then, as we saw even last time, sovereignty covenant is dynamic. That is the only reason God is able to inscribe it in our hearts. So that point again, because it is governed by this equation, that was the intent. God is able to institute this in our hearts, especially when he breathed his spirit into Adam's nostril. That is the point in time it got inscribed. So the point about it is, when you think about it, this is the same point. All the prophets, especially Daniel and Joseph, they must have had this visibility to the master sovereignty covenant inscribed in their hearts. That was the reason they were able to kind of interpret and foretell. And all that we are trying to do is we are trying to institutionalize and democratize it so that everybody can do it. The point again here is, okay, this is again just to create an awareness, but at the end of the day, it is not just for studying for the purposes of studying. The idea is application part. Remember Isaiah 44:7, proclaim it and foretell it. So the idea here is you got to apply it, and also you got to teach others. And then so that the idea is applying and using it to do your perfect will as per the purposes of God. That is the final ultimate purpose, because this equation will get balanced only when everybody starts fulfilling our complementary purposes, okay, collectively. That is the only when the whole equation gets balanced. That is only when Great Commission will get fulfilled. That is only when, in my humble opinion, the end will come. So hopefully that is the ultimate purpose why we are trying to do all this. I know we try to cover a lot of things in kind of 30-40 minutes. So hopefully you understood at least the big picture of it. So what I can do is let's open up the floor a little bit and then see what kind of questions we have, and then we can go from there. Everybody here?
Yeah, we're here.
All right. So like always, so it's running in